Hello everybody, this is question and answer number 7, and if you haven't seen any of these before, it doesn't matter where you jump in because they're pretty much standalone sets of questions that people have written into me, and I'm answering the questions as I go, and we've decided to make films of it so that it will reach a much broader audience. And today the first question is from, I'm not sure how to pronounce this, I think it's Ioannis. This person is asking, is there an optimal height to press the saw set plunger on saw teeth, as in position on the tooth? Are there any hazards of it being too low or too high? And I wanted to introduce something that this questioner might not have asked, or you may not have asked in that question, and that is, I just want to point out that not all saw sets are created equal, even though they may be made by the same manufacturer. This is an old one, this is a more modern one. There might be 30 years between manufacture, and that will make things differently, even though it may have been the original intention of the manufacturer to make them identically. They do vary between each one, and I've picked up even modern makers. Somax is a modern maker, and I've picked up two made in the same factory at the same time, and they've come out slightly differently. So you do have to bear that in mind. I want to point something out with this question, because what the questioner doesn't realize, I don't think, is that the saw set itself is suspended on the saw plate at two fixed points. So when you slide this onto the saw like this outside here and this outside here are on the tops of the teeth adjacent to one another, and there's a span of metal inside here that is wide enough to make sure that it spans two teeth. So you're going to hit a tooth either side of the tooth you want to set anyway. So when you lower it onto the plate like this, it's going onto those two fixed points. Can you see that? Click, click. So it's suspended on that fixed point. So when you actually press the plunger by squeezing the grip here, you squeeze the top is actually going down, the bottom is in a fixed position. So that moves a plunger forward inside here that we call the hammer. That presses it against this rotary wheel inside here that we call the anvil. So the hammer hits the anvil, and that's what bends the tooth. It literally bends, it doesn't really hammer it. But it's a good analogy there. So when we set this on the tooth, here's what happens generally. We position the set so that the plunger sits right on the very center of the point of the tooth. That's where it should sit. So it bends the tooth. We lower it onto those two fixed points, so it's at a fixed depth. So we really don't adjust it up and down to bend the tooth. We bend the whole side of the tooth, and that's what bends the tooth exactly the right place. But the issue for me, I wanted to point out, is the inequality between two saw sets. This saw set, I don't know if you can see it, but right inside here, the top of the plunger itself, the hammer, actually goes higher than the anvil that it's pressing the tooth against. So it's higher up. If I took another saw set by the same maker and put this one on the same tooth and I press it, this plunger is exactly the same height as the anvil it's pressing against. So when it presses the tooth, it's actually pressing it more of the top edge of the tooth. It's pressing much more of the tooth than this one is. This one actually bends it over the top of the anvil. So it will affect the set of the teeth. But it doesn't matter, because you're using one saw set on the whole saw in doing both sides of the teeth. So whichever saw set you use, it doesn't matter. You will experiment with this rotation on this rotary wheel here, because you get less set or more set according to this anvil, because it's got an eccentric wheel on there, and you go to a deeper set or a lighter set. If you've got a shallow set, you would go for, say, a number 12, which is the shallowest set this one does. If you want a big set, a very heavy set, you would go all the way around to the other end of the wheel, and you can see a slight discrepancy here, or it's actually substantial. It's probably 1.5 millimeters or 2 mil between the steep set on the number 4 and the light set on the number 12. That should explain everything, I'm pretty sure. So that's great. Thank you for the question. This question's from Aaron, and he said he has a question regarding pilot holes. How big should a pilot hole be to accommodate the screw? And it does vary with the wood, and it varies with the screw type as well. And the reason he's asking the question is we generally have 2 diameters in a screw. We have the diameter of the threads, and then we have the diameter inside the threads. If you can see in there, you'll see the main shank inside the screw. So that might be 3 millimeters, whereas the threads themselves might be 5 millimeters. But what you want to do is retain enough meat in the wood for the threads of the screw to bite into the wall of a hole. So let me drill a couple of holes and give you an example of the reason we do it. One, it makes the screw a whole lot easier going into the wood. So if we take a piece of wood like this piece here, this is quite thin stock. Let me do one thing first. Let me show you what happens if I don't drill a pilot hole, and then show you what happens if I do. So if I take a screw and drive it into the wood here, so I'm coming in from the end of this piece of wood here, like this, and watch what happens to the wood. Can you see that splitting the wood there? So it split it on both faces here, it's split here, and it's split down there. If I took a screw and did that along there, then those holes, that split is going to continue all along the edge. But if I put a pilot hole in there, that changes the whole thing. So can you see what I've got here? I've taken a drill bit. The drill bit is the size of the main body, the main shank of the screw inside the threads. So the threads are on either side of the hole. So when I drill a hole now, we go somewhere near there, about the same. This would be very unusual to actually put the screws near to the end like this, or less common. We try and avoid that, but sometimes it's necessary. So now when I take a screw and I drive it in here, the screw still bites here, but the wood didn't split. And I do that with all holes, so there's no sign of any splitting on the wood, and that's very important. So it took the main body of the screw. The threads are still biting into the wall of the wood or the wall of the hole, and that's why we drill pilot holes. If you were doing this in a hardwood, a more dense grain wood like rosewood, then I think I would even put a larger hole than this so that there is less screw thread going into the wall. So I might take an even larger hole like this, or a larger drill bit like this one, and make this even bigger than this one. That's where we have to experiment with the wood first, so we try it in different ways. So that's what we do in the reality of every day. We try things out. So that's that answer for you, Aaron. Thank you for that. It was a good question. We do that all the time. We pre-drill, pre-bore lots of times. This one's from Joel. I'm gluing up some panels to build a knockdown cabinet. I'm using dimensioned white oak. I cut it to rough length, then I planed each face, planed the edges, 2 together of course, then I glued them together, then I planed and scraped them to get the almost finished ready, get them almost finished ready. Then I dimensioned the panels to their final size, and next will come the joinery, then will come shaping arches at the bottom of the side panels. So he's telling me the sequence of things that he's done it, and I can't see anything wrong with what he's done. This then will come the final scraping and sanding, and then the finishing. Nothing wrong with what you've done there. But then you say, this seems like a reasonable order in which to work. Any suggestions? I'm thinking that I should have ripped the boards to width before I glued them up. And I think that's true. Generally, we take the width down to where our finished panel, after we've glued up, will just be slightly oversized, maybe 1/8 of an inch, 1/4 of an inch, 1/2 an inch, and then we'll rip down that last width after we've glued up. And so that would be the preferred way. But I think you've answered your own questions throughout there. I think you've done that's the reasonable or the practical way that we get our materials ready for something like that project. Of course, it will vary with every different project. You may not be gluing up panels. This I'm answering in terms of the way you phrase the question. So yeah, great. The other thing, though, I should add, I got a little note to myself here. We do have a number of stock videos on preparation of materials and so on. And we are planning on putting out some more, because there are more questions behind the questions that I wanted to answer of, when do you reverse the boards, or at what point do you do this or that. So I want to answer some of that too, for sequential cutting, where you might want to do buck matches and that kind of thing. Thank you, Aaron. That was great. Joel, that was great. This one's from Andy. He said that I have some wooden and infill planes. They have the blade bevels ground at 17 to 20 degrees. Now he's saying this as though this is something unusual, and I understand why he's saying it, because that we've kind of reached a legalistic way of grinding the bevel, and we grind everything at 25 degrees and nothing else will do. That's not the case at all. We'll talk about that in a second. The mouth is so tight on the infill plane that it appears one has to grind to less than 20 degrees for the iron to seat and extend sufficiently into the mouth. Is this low bevel angle something you have come across? Yes, for years, for centuries, probably 2 centuries, you will find that most chisel and plane irons were ground to anywhere between 15 and 20 degrees. They had these long sweeping bevels on them, and it's only in recent generations, in the last 50, 60 years, where we've become so legalistic that it has to be ground at 25 degrees. That's not the case at all. When they were grinding, they just ground it out, got it out of the way. It made no difference to the plane, the functionality of the plane. And on these older planes where the mouths were tight, especially on the panel planes, which were set aside for more refined work, they did have them very tight on the mouth. So that was the reason for that. So yes, you can grind your angles at 20, 25 degrees. That's perfectly okay. Anywhere from 17 to 25 degrees is perfectly acceptable. You don't have to be legalistic about it. So that's great. It's only been in the recent years that changed. So Brett's asking a question here. How long do you wait for rough lumber to settle or move? Do you dimension the wood to its final size and then set it aside, or do you dimension oversize and let it sit and then redimension again after the wood moves? I seem to have a problem with wood moving after I dimension it, and as I creep closer to the final size, it moves again. I think this is true, Brett. I think this happens a lot of times. We don't realize how much wood will absorb. If I take a board of wood like this and put it on my bench, leave it here overnight, the atmosphere is charged with moisture. The bench between the wood and the underside of the piece of wood is not absorbing moisture. This side, the end grain, is absorbing moisture. It changes overnight. Definitely it does. What I might suggest is that when you dimension your wood, you keep your wood in stock for as long as you can beforehand. That's what I try to do. I buy in materials. My atmosphere that I work in, I try to keep at a fairly constant level. And then when I come to work the wood is fairly stable. I can machine it, I can hand plane it, whatever I want. But I try not to leave it for too long before I get working on the joinery, because the joinery itself does constrain the wood. So we take the moisture content down, we dried it responsibly down to between 7 and say 11%. The atmosphere we're working in is going to be a little bit higher. But we start working with that wood. We've reduced as much as we can the possibility of change. But then we start working with the wood. We make the joints. The joinery itself constrains wood. It actually stops wood from changing shape. But we don't always realize that if you compress wood between two surfaces, say a frame, then that actually stops it from expanding, and it stops it from absorbing moisture, because wood is hygroscopic. And it stops it from expanding. It won't stop it from shrinking when it's in the frame. So if you have a higher moisture content, then it can shrink less than the frame. So joinery constrains it. Turn buttons on the underside of a tabletop constrains it. We try and work the wood as close to its milling time as possible. So if we're doing joinery, we try and do it within the same day even. If we can't do that, shrink wrap it, put it in a plastic bag, and reduce the amount of moisture that can get back into that wood by reabsorption, which it will do. If you've got a rainy day, the doors are open on your workshop, we try and constrain that by closing the doors, keeping the heat up a little bit. Things like that, we do as much as we can to prevent any changes. Ben, you seem to advocate sharpening from coarse through extra fine on every occasion, followed by stropping. What are the benefits of going back through all the stones if you're using an already well-maintained and sharp tool? Well, a well-maintained and sharp tool, there is no such thing. You can't sharpen a plane and then keep it in that maintained condition by just using it. You're deteriorating the cutting edge every time you take a shaving, so you're not maintaining it. It's being damaged every time you use it. So what you have to do is go back to the beginning, go through the same process, because the fastest way to get back to a cutting edge is to get that bevel down, back into the main body of steel, and go through the same processes. It's much faster to do it that way than it is to go to a final level of abrading, because it's all abrading, and to try to get back to a cutting edge again. Much quicker to go all the way back to the beginning, every time, never fails. Okay, Raul, while cutting a dovetail, when I chisel out the middle pieces, there is tear out on the end grain. It leaves a small cavity. Why does it happen, and how do I avoid it? Several reasons for this. It could be, I assume that you're not using the coping saw to cut out the main body of waste. I'm assuming that you are using my main method, although I do use a coping saw sometimes, but mostly I don't. And I use a chisel. You chop down and then you chisel in, chop down, chisel in. And when you do that, sometimes your chisel is getting duller and duller by each blow. So you start to compress the fibers and you put unnecessary pressure on the end grain. Then it starts to tear out. You're working from both sides. There's more resistance as you get nearer to the center. It's getting steeper. And it tends to rip out like a tooth out of a socket in a gum. And that's what happens with the wood. So sharp chisel, keep sharpening up. Sharpen up 2 or 3 times during your dovetail. Depends on the nature of the wood too. Soft woods tend to tear out that way. Some hardwoods will, but mostly the hardwoods will give you a better finish. But that's great. Thank you for that one, Raul. Question from SM Clark. What are your thoughts on skew planes? I haven't found any mention of them in your incredible book. I didn't put that bit in. Or in any of your YouTube videos. The answer I've given is, I assume that you're talking about bench planes for surface planing, not rebate planes. Rebate planes were skewed because the skewing of the blade, when it's pushed into the corner of a rebate, it pulls itself to task and pulls itself to that inside corner. On smoothing planes, there are not very many smoothing planes that have skew blades in them. Very, very rare indeed. So we tend not to raise the issue because they weren't common. They weren't really used at all. So thanks for all your questions again, and these are really helping a lot of people. We'll keep answering them as long as you keep asking questions, and always remember that the hardest question to answer is the one that's never asked.